So my name's Hannah Bernstein. I'm one of the clinicians working for Zhang Therapy. I'm presently an associate marriage and family therapist under the supervision of Hong Zhang, who's conducting this interview. And I, in my time as a practicing therapist, have more than once, probably upwards of 10 times, been approached by people who were concerned about loved ones who were expressing thoughts of suicide, what gets called clinically suicidal ideation. And another one of those requests came in the last couple of weeks, and I found myself kind of looking for online resources of how to support someone who's actively suicidal. Finding some, but also having kind of a nuanced view of how I see this subject. I wanted to sort of compile those ideas in one place so I'd have a handy reference in case this came up in the future, and also so that anyone could access this if they wanted to. So the way I define suicidality is any thoughts and feelings of death, of the desire to end one's own life. And that's a wide spectrum. So that can range from questioning the meaning of existence in a sort of philosophical way, to maybe having some really hard days where you're like not sure you want to get out of bed in the morning, like the terms of life don't make sense, at least in that moment, all the way to the kind of imminent desire to end one's own life that should be hospitalized because there's an immediate threat. So like I mentioned before, there's a range of severity, all the way from abstract thoughts about the meaning of life or whether life in its present state has meaning, to the kind of suicidality that should be hospitalized because that person's a danger to themselves. And the way that we assess is based on a lot of different criteria, some of which is statistically associated with safer outcomes or less safe outcomes. So an example of this might be that someone who has previously attempted to commit suicide is a higher risk for another attempt or ending their life. There are also protective factors. Protective factors can include having relationships that are meaningful to the person, having positive responsibilities like a job that they care about. Even having a pet can be a protective factor because that person's going to want to stay alive to take care of that pet. And there's lots more detail on that in training programs for people who are on like suicide crisis lines. Often there's a scale of severity. They might talk about low suicide risk, medium suicide risk, high suicide risk, and then like imminent threat. Imminent threat would be needs immediate hospitalization, needs an intervention immediately. So low risk might be thoughts of suicide without a plan or means. That would be a way in which to kill themselves that they have in mind, and without a time at which they do it. Medium risk might be one of these factors, but not all of them. High risk would be having the means, having a way to kill themselves and the intent to kill themselves, but not necessarily having a time they plan to do it soon. So a high-risk person might, for example, have a plan, but the plan is, 3 weeks off. So there's time for a few more interventions before that emergency intervention in that specific moment. All of these do require care, but the reason that something like a crisis hotline would sort of triage in this way is so that they can devote their time and resources towards people who have that highest degree of threat, so that the phone lines are cleared for people who might actually end their lives that day. There are a variety of approaches, and I think a variety of approaches that do work, but there are probably good best practices and certainly things one should avoid. Being confrontational or angry with a suicidal person is likely to exacerbate their feelings of unease, and make them less invested in sticking around. So I would certainly avoid escalating the conflict in that way. I'd also avoid being dismissive. I can think of examples I know of where someone maybe went to a parent and said, you know, I'm thinking of ending my life. And the response was something like, if that were true, you'd be dead already. You know, like really dehumanizing, dismissive things can come up. And that's very unfortunate. And those are certainly things to avoid. I think when it comes to what should you do, a great place to start is compassionate listening and compassionate inquiry. And what I mean by that is really giving the person a chance to fully express what's on their mind and in their heart, even if those thoughts are, you know, disturbing, right? We don't want to hear that people we love intend to kill themselves, or why they think that life is unlivable, especially if the things they're vocalizing have to do with the relationship with the person listening. That can feel blaming or shaming. So again, I would really encourage someone in the position of being approached by a friend or a loved one with thoughts of suicide to, as much as they can, remind themselves that as disturbing or confronting as those thoughts can be, the person who's thinking of ending their life is not the person to process your feelings of unease with. That should happen with a professional or with a friend who you can trust with those thoughts. Finally, I think it's really important to establish how much you care about that person and just be overt about it. I think it's good to say, like, I would be really sad if you died. It matters to me that you're in my life, that you're around, and maybe even think about a few examples of reasons that it's important to you that this person's in your life. I think here about the film, the classic film, It's a Wonderful Life, where you see that the protagonist desires to kill themselves and then sees like a version of life, how life would be if they hadn't been around. And I think we don't really know how much we mean to other people, how much we touch other people's lives until that's no longer present. So the state of mind of depression can really distort reality and make people think that they're not important. So it can be a good thing to remind someone you love who's in that state of their good qualities, the qualities they can't see in that moment. So it's really important that this not be limited to one conversation, right? This person is not going to suddenly and immediately feel like they can go on without ongoing support. So certainly finding a competent therapist is a good place to start. And there's lots of different ways to access therapy. Certainly you can look in a resource like Psychology Today or Therapy Den, where there'll be therapists advertised, and you can usually search for who takes your insurance, who's in your area, who's offering the kind of care you're looking for. And then there's also community mental health, which is more affordable. Sometimes there's long wait lists, but this is a service that's often offered by say like a psychology graduate program. Will have people who are in training on campus, and they'll offer therapy on a sliding scale at much more affordable rates. I, for example, got sliding scale therapy at a rate of, I think, $35 a session when I was younger, and that was really helpful for my budget at the time. And then certainly if you have that kind of imminent threat of suicidality, you should get emergency services. So there's two ways of accessing this within the United States. Certainly calling 911 is an option. It can be a confrontational option, especially for someone who has a fear of police officers, which does happen. And then there's also psychiatric emergency services teams in most major cities. So that'll be usually like a van with like psychiatric professionals who can come to you and assess for suicidality. Wait times are longer for that team. So dialing 911 if you don't know what to do is probably a decent option. I would tell people explicitly to let whoever you talk to at dispatch know that this is a wellness check. That's a term that's known to them, and that the person does not have any weapons and does not intend to harm anyone, as those kinds of calls will be handled differently than other kinds of emergencies. We're often afraid to talk about death, especially in typical modern American society. But death is sort of an inevitable part of life. And there can actually be kind of like richness mined from asking yourself the question, you know, why am I alive? Why do I choose to be alive? There's a specific modality of therapy known as existential therapy, where that question gets really explicitly explored. You know, if we're here, if we're going to exist, like why? So I think that as low as these lows can be, there's a sort of hope, if you're able to reframe it and look at choosing to live as a really affirmative choice, and finding ways to make meaning after a schism like suicidality. So I would encourage people to reframe this not as an entirely negative experience. Absolutely, it's a challenging experience, but that after a reckoning with life itself, life can be even more meaningful than before. So I do think there's hope.